Hi there, I'm Mr. Jackson,
And I'm Ms. Spalding.
and today we're going to run through KCI's Assignment Completion Framework. This is something that the instructional leadership at KCI has been developing based on some of the suggestions that staff have come up with regarding assignments and assignments that come in late and kind of handling some of these concerns that staff have been experiencing over the past couple of months. And so really where we want to start is by talking about where as a staff we left off and some of the concerns that we had moving forward that formed our guiding principles in developing a framework for how to deal with late assignments and how to encourage students to get stuff handed in on time. So here are kind of the guiding principles. So this is what you told us that you wanted in a framework.
So, what we heard you saying when we started to talk about this at our PD session in September was that you wanted to have flexibility, but you at the same time wanted there to be a consistent framework and a consistent message that we were all using across the board. You wanted something that's simple, so easy to implement, not a make work project. You wanted that framework to be based on a deeper philosophical understanding, and that if we based it on this philosophical understanding, we think we'd get better student as well as staff buy-in. You want the framework to develop student ownership, that they acknowledge that there's a problem and that they're the ones who are responsible for coming up with a plan about how to deal with that problem. And finally, you wanted a variety of tools to be available to you. And so hopefully this framework offers some suggestions of tools that you may already be using, but also of tools and strategies that you might not have thought of before.
Okay, so we're going to roll out what we think this framework looks like, and where we're going to start is actually very, very simple. We're going to start with a time axis, okay? So this is going to show kind of time marching forward. And at some point during your course, you're going to assign a summative assessment. So this would be time T1 perhaps, and we assign that summative assessment. And as time, of course, ticks away, there comes a point when, of course, that assignment is going to be due. And so what happens in between here, what happens before we give the assignment, and what happens after the due date is what we're going to discuss. So we've got three different phases now that we're going to talk about. We've got the pre-phase, we've got, of course, after you've assigned, but before the due date, so the during phase, and we've got the post phase. And so our assignment, or our framework kind of breaks down in this form. So to begin, in the pre-assessment phase.
So this step of the process, we want there to be a consistent message, a consistent process that all KCI staff follow. And the basis of this portion of the framework is that here is where we're sharing our philosophy. Here's why we think work needs to get completed. Here's why it needs to get completed on time. Here's why deadlines are important, and that we can address this in a fairly consistent way. So we have a little checklist here that we think might be helpful for each teacher to follow. Firstly, assessments will be purposeful, relevant, and linked to the essential learnings. We wanted there to be an obvious connection here for the student about why they're doing this assignment. And we thought that if we shared this message, I expect that all students are fully engaged in the learning process taking place in this class. If that's a consistent message, that's something you could potentially put on your course outline, that students would come to understand that being fully engaged in the learning process means completing the assignments. I'll only give you work that's meaningful for you, so I expect you to do it. And that falls to the next step of the checklist. Assessments are to be completed and submitted on time. There are deadlines, we expect you to meet them. And we could have conversation with the students about what are the benefits for you of completing and submitting your work on time, and what would be the consequences, the natural consequences, the real world consequences, not late mark penalties anymore. However, there are still consequences and drawbacks to not completing your work on time that go beyond just having poor learning skills on your report card, which maybe don't hold enough meaning for our teens at this point in time. And finally, that this philosophy rather should be addressed at some point in your course outline, but that can be a consistent message that's delivered to students right from day one, and that gets sent to parents as well.
Mhm. I think one of the things that, that's really, really important is to point out that a lot of this, philosophy is based on what a lot of teachers are doing at the present time. But it is important that we kind of paint this consistent message. And so these are a couple of things that may challenge us from time to time. Is asking ourselves, is this assessment that we're giving at this point in time, does it fit with our philosophy? Like, is it one of the tied to one of the essential learnings for the course? And this is very, very important too. And this was talked about quite extensively at our staff meeting. Is that we do expect that assessments are completed and submitted on time, and that is an expectation that we have. And now we have to move forward and say, okay, how do we ensure that? So during the middle phase here, this is where we're going to see a lot of flexibility. Okay, and this is one of those things where people are going to be able to assess formatively in many different stages. So what we're going to do now is we're going to suggest things that you can do early in the process, things that you can do perhaps middle of the way through the process, and things that perhaps as that due date is approaching, what are some of those formative things that you could do a little bit later on? Now, these are suggestions. I think, all of us are going to have different strategies and different tools, but this is where we're going to kind of give you some of the ones that we've come up with and other staff have suggested.
And in the spirit of flexibility, we want you to not feel tied to using certain strategies only in the early formative stage or only in the late formative stage. Please feel free to use them whenever it makes sense to do so.
The one thing that probably will be common amongst all teachers is this idea of tracking. Because tracking is something that's going to happen, well, certainly throughout the semester, but definitely during the time when you've given a summative assessment to the time when that summative assessment is due. We need to check in and we need to be on top of where our students are at in the process. We always say that, when you come to that unit test, you never want to be surprised by the results of your class. And if you are surprised by the results of your class, perhaps one of the reasons is because we haven't been tracking as the unit has gone along. One of the things also that's going to happen throughout the process is conversations with students. And this goes hand in hand with tracking, but this is important. So early in the process, perhaps some of those conversations may include things like setting up some learning goals and setting up some success criteria specifically for this summative assessment and what you're hoping to get out of it. We may also see teachers devising a due date that's going to work with their students and optimize that level of achievement. So perhaps you're picking and devising a due date that's going to fit with their schedules and what they've got going on in other courses. We also have this aspect, and this is something that very often we need to try and teach students or even coach students through, this idea of chunking, which is really about breaking assignments down into smaller manageable parts. And that's something that you could certainly scaffold early on and then roll out and kind of release a little bit of that control. But this is something that is a definite strategy that a lot of people have engaged in. A little bit later on through the process, perhaps some of the strategies that you might see are student-teacher conferences, and actually having purposeful conversations where you're sitting down with a student, you're saying, okay, let me see your work, let me see what you've done. And also, adhering to multiple soft due dates. So perhaps setting a date for a student-teacher conference on a certain day, halfway through. And it's not a hard due date, but it certainly is a suggested due date.
And it can go hand in hand with the chunking then of your assignments.
Exactly.
You can check in after certain chunks are done to see how that student is progressing.
Okay, so a little bit later on in the process, and certainly something that can happen at any time is parental contact. Certainly we're going to want to be contacting parents before a due date if you've noticed that, there's some of these soft due dates that have not happened. and we're starting to get worried because our tracking has shown us, oh my goodness, this kid doesn't have anything done. But it is important to note that, this kind of parent contact can happen at any time throughout this process if you think it can help, right? Students are not meeting formative deadlines. This could be a warning sign, and this would be a good time to contact parents. And it doesn't have to be just a telephone call. It could be. And for many of us, that's the form that we would prefer it to take. But it could be an email, and certainly it could be an email that's generated by MarkBook. It could be through Edmodo and through the parent interaction part of Edmodo. It could be face-to-face at parent-teacher interviews or having a meeting after school. Kind of whatever you're comfortable with, parent contact can happen throughout the process. And perhaps we might even say that it shouldn't wait until after we haven't hit the due date. If you feel it would help a student, it's an option that you have in your back pocket to contact home at any time.
And in addition to that, it could be contact with all of the parents for all of your students. It might not be an individual parent contact. So perhaps you have a teacher website and you want to post reminders about assignments or upcoming deadlines there, and that's something parents are tuned into and can just find out information kind of more generically, just so that they're in the loop about upcoming deadlines.
A little bit later in the process, you might engage in peer review with your students to get them to look at each other's work, comment, and provide some formative feedback.
And that can be a really effective strategy because they know they have to produce something to show their friends, and it can be really embarrassing to show up on a day where you're reviewing work and not to have any work to share as part of that process.
Another option that we can use is student success and our room 231 at KCI. Certainly, this can be something where if a student perhaps isn't making good use of time in MSIP, we have also here as a tool the use of MSIP. But if they're not using their time in MSIP and we need a little bit more focused work time, the use of student success is an option that's also available. It's something that we would need to probably chit chat a little bit more. If it's 1 or 2 periods, then perhaps a phone call to room 231 or a conversation. But there is a process in place for this that we can discuss a little bit later on.
Our team talked a lot about using MSIP and how would one use our current process of sending green sheets in MSIP mailboxes in order to notify MSIP teachers about upcoming deadlines. But we talked about making use of them. They don't necessarily have to be attached to an assignment. You could just write something on the green sheet about this student should be working on this assignment if you have concerns that they're not working toward meeting that deadline.
And I think certainly, perhaps at the very end, having formative assessment and perhaps questions that you've used throughout as part of your summative assessment. And this is something that I think certainly, I would have done in math and science, and I'm sure other subject areas have too. You let them know that, hey, like this formative assessment that I'm giving you is going to show up again, and it's directly going to be related to what's on your test or what's on your assignment. And so certainly this is another thing that we can do and we can let our students know about. Mm-hmm. Really what happens next is this due date. And so the due date comes and we're in a situation where students haven't handed in an assessment. And so now we're past the due date. Now we need to know, okay, well, what happens? So this is another one of those areas where, we would like to suggest that consistency across our staff is going to be really important. Okay? So how we track and basically everything that goes on in between is very flexible. But once that due date passes, as a staff, we need to be consistent with our approach. And so we've suggested a checklist for us to go through and for us to kind of look at.
And even this checklist is kind of broken down into steps. So the first step will be that there must be an acknowledgement that the student has missed the deadline. We want them to take ownership of the fact that they haven't completed their work on time. How you go about acknowledging that late is totally up to you. Perhaps they're going to sign in on a sheet. Perhaps they're going to fill out a form. Perhaps they're only going to have a conversation with you. Perhaps they're going to send you a message on Edmodo. But in some way, they need to indicate I missed the deadline. And that the first step should be that you renegotiate a due date with the student. You have to give them an opportunity to come up with a plan about how they're going to solve their problem. That this is their problem, that they didn't meet a deadline. Now, that's negotiated, so you certainly have complete availability to discuss that due date and to suggest something with them. It's not that what they say goes, but certainly give them an opportunity to come up with a plan on how to solve their problem.
I would say certainly along with these two, but perhaps maybe after these two things have happened, the phone call needs to go home. And perhaps if this is done, say on the day of the due date or maybe the day after the due date, the phone call home happens on the same day that you negotiate this with the student. So perhaps quickly after, but parents do need to be in the loop. And so when this happens, we need to say, this is the due date. The due date was missed. This is the renegotiated due date that we've decided with the student. And we need your help from home to get this in. We can also at this point now seriously consider tapping into MSIP and or student success. So if it's going to be a short-term thing, right, we can kind of call 231 and perhaps the student can come and work. If it's going to be a long-term arrangement, then we need to be completing a referral form. And referral to student success can happen in a couple of ways. We can either remove the student from their MSIP so they get some support in student success. Perhaps even we remove the student from class for a few days and they get support in student success. And then along with these, of course, the last step in the process is a VP referral.
So the time to call in the VP is when you decide that what you have here is a behavioral concern. Not completing the work on time might have been an organizational issue or related to other circumstances about the student's life. But if they've renegotiated due date with you and then they've failed to meet that renegotiated due
That's
date,
sent to the VP.
yes, it becomes that behavior concern, and our admin team is quite willing to support us in dealing with those behavioral issues.
And so this is where we're at. I think one of the things that we need to remember is that, as we've kind of alluded to throughout, that this is a framework. Ms. Spalding and I have been challenging ourselves to use the word framework rather than using the word policy, because these are suggestions for things that we as a staff should be doing to maintain consistency and to give teachers a little bit of flexibility in how we approach the issue of late assignments and things that come in on time. And so, from here, we move forward, given this framework and given where we're at, and hopefully, you can do a little bit of learning from this, and hopefully this has been helpful to set a context.